Hello, welcome back. Let's just get straight into this. I watched The Return of the King from 1980, and I have some interesting opinions on this film. I've reviewed The Hobbit from the 70s, and I reviewed the 1978 Lord of the Rings, which these were kind of my gateway drug into Tolkien's world as a child. I had these on VHS, and I think I wore the tapes out many times. They were favourites. And I've said this, especially with The Hobbit and The Return of the King, which is kind of a pseudo-sequel to Lord of the Rings. It kind of picks up where that left off. It has its charms. The animation is pretty. A lot of the animators who did this film and The Hobbit founded Studio Ghibli. And it kind of explains the look of this a little bit more. It's a really pretty film. And visually, I like animation of this era. It wasn't scared to kind of be a little bit dark and a little bit grim. There are definitely some moments where I can say that the animation does fall apart. You can definitely tell there's a bit of cheapness going on to this. But I like that animation style. The Last Unicorn is a prime example of that. And this does a efficient job. And that's the word I will use for this film. It's efficient. It crams the entirety of The Return of the King into 98 minutes. They've edited out a lot of the subplots and other things that go on. And I mean, it works to a point. The film is often mistaken for a sequel to The Lord of the Rings as well. That's a whole big thing, but they're definitely not they're definitely not linked. There's no connection there. And the sequel to Lord of the Rings was cancelled, so that's a whole other story within itself. Critics at the time were very mixed. A few people at the time gave it like 3 out of 5, said it was a cartoon tale, was darker, more complex than others in the series, and that's very true. Even the director said we tried to do Return of the King, but it was an awful lot to put in it. And it shows. Legolas and Gimli are removed from this completely. The plot is condensed down, focusing on Bilbo's plot more than anything. And I think, honestly, this is what I will say. This is a good intro for children to Tolkien's world. And I mean that. It's not a great adaptation. It's not going to blow your mind by any means. But it's an interesting intro. And I think it definitely has its charms. I think it's a charming movie. I think the soundtrack is very nice. The score is very nice. I own the soundtracks to these. They were special editions. I find it kind of interesting how they adapted it. Because obviously it's been toned down for children. The subplots, everything's kind of been moved a little bit and a little bit softer. Some of the darker themes are definitely pushed aside, although this is surprisingly a dark movie. But again, I think a lot of animation and children's movies from the 70s and into the 80s and even the early 90s, the darker tone was a thing. Love it or hate it, The Black Cauldron is a prime example of that. The Last Unicorn, which is a personal favourite of mine. And I wonder if they had tried to adapt the whole thing. Like the what if questions. There isn't a huge amount of trivia on IMDb about this film. It seems to have been not forgotten, because it definitely has its fans, but it's kind of on a lower tier. People talk more about The Hobbit or the 1978 Lord of the Rings than this. I think it does the themes of Tolkien's work very well. I think it does that kind of heroic journey, and it does that very well. But it is that condensed, squashed version. It's like the abridged footnotes version you would get for a class in school. And there's nothing wrong with that by any means. And it still actually does a far better job than the Rings of Power, but admittedly, when that bar is so low already, it's kind of meh. You have a low bar, and this is definitely well above that bar. I look at it now and I think, how could this have happened, how, you know, production, animation side, and the development of this film. It's quite an interesting little one to look into, and I'm not going to go into the full thing here. But what I will add to this video is that stuff like this is important. Is it a particularly great, mind-blowing movie? No. Is the voice acting good? Yes. Is the animation nice? 95% of it looks really good. Is this film intended for children? Yes. And I think, like I said before, it's a nice intro. I wore out these tapes as a child. My uncle got them for me. And I love them. I used to watch them on repeat. And it was always like a big treat to watch these movies. I think if you're going to do something, create something like this, I do wonder how it could be done now. Because J.R. Tolkien turned down Walt Disney and The Hobbit. Not many people know this story, but not as many as you would think. He turned down Walt Disney, which would be... I do wonder how Disney would have interpreted The Hobbit. Like, that's a whole video into itself. And as someone who doesn't particularly like Disney and doesn't like giving them money, and to say the least on the subject, I do wonder. Like, there have been some very great Disney classics over the years. And in my head, I'm picturing something more akin to like The Sword in the Stone or The Dark Cauldron, rather than Winnie the Pooh or Snow White, you know. Although Snow White tone would work very well. Again, this is a nice children's movie. That's the only way I can describe it. It's Lord of the Rings, Return of the King Light. And I do wonder how this kind of adaptation has affected others as it's gone on, because the 78 Lord of the Rings has definitely had an influence. The scene in the tavern with the wing wraiths and the swords and the beds. But watching this, it just took me back to that nice happy place. It took me back to that kind of escapism and wonderment of being a child, and I like that. I do like that. I like the feel of it. I do watch these and wonder, if I hadn't have watched these movies, would I have been so involved in the world? Because these are my childhood, and yes, there is some nostalgia goggles, but I do wonder that. These films were a fundamental part of my childhood. They're not amazing production, by any means. They're not going to blow your mind. They're not on the level of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films. I watch them and I'm like, I can see why I loved them as a kid. I loved fantasy as a child. And there are countless other adaptations of Lord of the Rings, most of them foreign, ironically enough. You know, you watch them and you think, okay, this is weird. Some of them go down some very weird territory. There is a adaptation of, well, I say inspired by Lord of the Rings adaptation that was done in 1971. It's Swedish. And that's strange. I'll put it this way, that's the one on LSD. I'll put it that way, but it's definitely a odd adaptation. Then there is a very interesting little Russian take on The Hobbit in 1985, which seems to have been lost. And I've had to download that with fan-made subtitles to watch it. And there are two versions, which makes it interesting. The timing difference between them is like 50 seconds or something ridiculous. And there's another Russian series that happened, and I think it was 1991, and it was thought to be lost. That's a really, again, Russian adaptations of Lord of the Rings is a weird thing to go into, and early green screen. But you know what? Some of them do well, and I think this adaptation did well. I think it, as a film, as an animated children's movies, it's sweet, it's charming. No one's on drugs. I'm sorry, I'm flashing back to that. But these films, these three movies were such a fundamental part of my childhood that I can firmly accept they're far from perfect, but they definitely have their good moments. When you have something so influential, it's charming to go back. And nice intros for kids into this world, this rich, beautiful world. And I think if you've got kids, watch them. Watch them. Just do it. So tell me what you think in the comments below. I will talk to you guys a bit later, and have a wonderful day.